I was reflecting on, when I was flying up here last night, that it's somewhat interesting for me to be sharing on this topic here at this conference, at this college. I'm not a graduate of Moore, though I have very much appreciated its ministry for a very long time. I was born, raised, and theologically trained in Melbourne. And when it comes to this topic in particular, you may wonder what hath Melbourne to do with Sydney, especially when it comes to this issue. It's actually distinguished many parts of evangelicalism between Melbourne and Sydney, which has offered a really interesting perspective. And so I'm hoping that might have something to offer. So here are my three outcomes for our time today. So firstly, I'm hoping to help all of us understand how our church, as an example, has been seeking to enculturate biblical complementarianism. I want to say that we're by no means exemplary, but we're just one church that's trying to do our best in our very particular, and I suspect somewhat unique circumstance as well. Secondly, and I think this one's probably the most important one, at least as I've reflected on things, I want to at least try and identify some of those hidden beliefs, assumptions, and cultures that actually inform our theological position. But not just our theological position, but also our posture and our practice. So let me explain. As we went about drafting our position paper, we realised that a whole range of underlying issues emerged that we didn't actually quite expect. We thought it'd be as easy as just writing something, putting it out there, and be done with it. But we realised if we were going to clearly articulate what we thought about men and women in the church, our position was actually going to be 1/3 of the answer. We also needed to be clear about our ministry practice, so what we were going to do. But I actually want to offer we needed to be even clearer about our posture. That is our approach, the sort of culture that we want to have. We didn't just want to focus on articulating what it is that we believe or what it is that we do, but we wanted to be clearer about how men and women ought to relate to one another in the life of our church. The great line, the vibe of the thing, and that's kind of what we wanted to try and capture as well. Thirdly, I'm hoping that all of us can leave this elective with something of a clear next step, one thing that all of us can do to enculturate complementarity a little bit more deeply in the life and ministry of our church or ministry context. They're my three outcomes that I'm hoping to get to in our time together. Here are my four inputs, hopefully things that we can do, to look firstly at our church's context and how that shaped our approach to this task. Secondly, I want to then set out the 7 steps that we took and are still taking. Thirdly, I'll share the greatest hits of our theological vision with all of you, where we landed on a number of issues, and on the particularly controversial and spicy ones, we'll leave them to question and answer later. So you can ask me them, and Lord willing, this will never be placed online. So, or at least the Q&A part. Let me get to our context, and I think our context, I'll spend a bit of time here because it is quite important. Firstly, we're a church plant. We launched in 2019 with just 24 people. And this Sunday, actually, under God, we're celebrating our 6th anniversary as a church. We've got two services now, about 250 adults and 9 children. So demographic tidal wave, you may pray for us. Now, because we're a church plant, we actually had a pretty unique opportunity. We had the opportunity to articulate our view of men and women because in many ways, we didn't have a pre-existing culture. It's not as if we've been a long-established church with 60 years of a particular form of complementarianism or strong egalitarianism to change. In many ways, it was a blank slate. But whilst we didn't have one pre-existing culture, here's the challenge of a church plant, we actually inherited many pre-existing cultures. You see, with every bit of transfer growth came another Christian with their own beliefs, cultures, and practices. So we've actually had to try and articulate our view of men and women to about 250 different Christians from different denominational backgrounds and theological traditions, not to mention the conversion growth of unchurched people who come to faith and are more shaped by a surrounding culture around us. Though I would say, I think we've struggled more to convince the Christians than the non-Christians in our task. So there's something interesting. Being a church plant presents both opportunities but also challenges as you're dealing with a high degree of diversity. Secondly, very proudly and unashamedly, we are in the city of Melbourne, and that's very important. In 2018, Dan Andrews, he declared Victoria to be the most progressive state in the nation. I think he's right. Every time I come up to Sydney, particularly over the last few years, everyone's like, oh, you poor people. How could you have lived under that lockdown for that long? And I'm like, well, I didn't like it, but he got voted back in that many times. And I think it says that as a state, Victoria is more progressive. And I think that's just something to reckon with. And I think that progressivism bleeds into our church culture as well, both for good and for ill. So I suspect that unlike in some parts of Sydney, that evangelicalism in Melbourne is theologically broader. In many ways, the value is on unity and embracing people rather than clarity. In Melbourne, evangelicalism has been defined historically more than theologically. And so when we say evangelical, we mean to include Reformed types, but also charismatics, Arminians, a broader range of non-Reformed traditions. And at least anecdotally, it is generally the case that within evangelical churches in Melbourne, egalitarianism is by far the predominant value that's there, either by conviction or practice. And I think this is what has made it hard for people in our church, which is that there's no plausibility structures. As they look around to their friends at other churches, what is complementarianism? What does that actually look like? And when we do look to some of the other complementarian churches, they also happen to be socially conservative. Now, what does that mean? It means that, I don't mind this, but some churches do look at our church with a degree of suspicion. People say, oh, you sure you want to go there? That's the church with those strange views about men and women. But it also means that men and women in our church have no friends. They have no one at other churches to look to, no plausibility structures, no sense of what it ought to look like. So we're a church plant, we're in Melbourne, and we're part of FIC. This is a significant factor because it means that we don't have an inherited polity or governance structure. We're not bound by Presbyterian code or an Anglican episcopacy. In many ways, it's a choose-your-own adventure. Like most FIC churches, we're actually an incorporated association. And that means, more than anything else, people think about governance in terms of corporate governance structures, less than inherited polities. Now, that gives us a certain sort of flexibility with things. We can change and adapt our governance structure to give best expression to our theological convictions. That's a great advantage, but it also comes with significant risks and challenges as well. So, church plant in Melbourne, FIC, interesting one, largely young and Asian Australian. I think that it means a few things. I think it means that the average person in our church is a university-educated professional. That means that we've last year had a fair bit of scope to go pretty hard on nuanced theological thinking. That's been a fun thing that we could do. We've been able to push our congregation just a little bit harder to think just a little bit more deeply. And being largely Asian Australian, I think it means that I suspect that we've been less exposed to successive waves of feminism and progressivism. I think that just hasn't affected us to the same extent, though it's still there. And B, we're also culturally more compliant and submissive to authority. So when it comes to this issue, that kind of helps, and so I've praised God for that. Let me offer the most awkward factor of all, me. So I think the senior pastor's role in everything is quite significant. Now, I feel a bit awkward highlighting this factor, but it does matter. So strangely to announce, I'm getting married next week, which means that for the first time in 6 years, our church will be pastored by a married man. Now, the first 6 years, that confused everyone that I was. It confused most of Reach Australia, to be honest, as well. So, boss, here's my suspicion that generally speaking, the church will eventually reflect the type of complementarity that is modelled by the senior pastor and his wife, for better or for worse. So you can't be what you can't see, but once you see it, you kind of can't help but be it as well. Now, that can be a strength, but it can also be a weakness. And I think we need to pay attention to not just what is taught in our churches, but also what is caught. And in my church, it turned out to be the case that there was no pastor's wife to see or to be. And that raised a whole range of questions in our church life. What's our approach to women's ministry when we can't assume that there's a pastor's wife to run it? How do I, as an unmarried man, pastor women in the church? And if we appoint a woman to pastor women, how do we do that in a way that doesn't just divide the church where all the men come and see me and all the women go and see her, and then you effectively have two parallel churches running within one structure? So why do I labour all that point in terms of context? I hope you can see that just like with the Bible in ministry, our context really matters. We can't just copy and paste someone else's approach and dump it in our church. So I share these 5 factors to highlight that every church and ministry context is unique. And so now I want to share 7 steps that we're taking to at least try and enculturate complementarianism. And I trust that all of us here will do the necessary cultural translation to our context. Let me run through them. Here they are. Read everything. Write something. Start consulting. Reflect deeply. Go public. Make changes. Keep discipling. And you'll notice that these 7 steps aren't a pathway or a pipeline. They're kind of an ecosystem. That's how you know you're part of an FIC church. We use words like that, outcomes, inputs, ecosystems. But it is important because our task is never quite done. We have to keep reading. Our theological vision at its best is a living document. And our churches have to keep being reformed according to God's word. So here's the first step that I took about 14 months ago. I tried to read as much as I could. So here's some of the things and articles that I read. Interestingly, right at the beginning, you'll notice that I wasn't just reading articles on complementarianism, but also on the nature of pastoral leadership. Because so much of this issue actually touches on the roles, the responsibilities, and the authorities of a pastor. And it dawned on me very quickly that if we were to articulate our view of men and women in the church, we wouldn't be able to get away with it without also articulating what we thought about authority and the structure of church. So that was important. Secondly, this was somewhat terrifying. Here's the books and books chapters I tried to read or dipped into. I tried to engage with some egalitarian readings as well, so I wasn't just kind of in a complementarian echo chamber. I do want to offer that having done my theological education in a different college, it was somewhat helpful because I already had some broad exposure to egalitarian perspectives and interaction with egalitarian friends. So none of that was entirely new, but it was important for me to keep listening. Curiously, I think engaging with some of Brian Rosner's stuff and Carl Trueman on personal identity and culture was quite significant as well. Because I suspect that egalitarianism is in the air that we breathe. And I didn't just want to write a position paper for our church. No, I wanted to engage our culture to shape our minds and our hearts. If we want this culture of biblical complementarity to last, it has to go beyond a superficial practice. It has to become part of our church culture as well. But we can't do that unless we understand the culture that our church is being shaped by. And finally, and really interestingly, I read as many position papers as I could of other churches and ministries to see how they approach things as well. So I'm sorry that font is ridiculously tiny. Let me share with you some observations that I had after reading a bunch of stuff. Firstly, it struck me that some position papers in particular made everything purely a women's issue. It was all about what women can do in church or what they can't do in church, which was sad because I think it failed to account for the reality that this is actually about how women and men together relate to one another. So it wasn't a comprehensive vision of much, it was a very narrow vision that just focused on what women can do. It also occurred to me that when I would engage with the biblical and theological resources, they were great when it came to exegesis and systematics, but much of the resources had very little to say about contemporary culture and ministry expression. Beyond the Sunday sermon and the office of elder, most resources didn't really offer much by way of concrete models, systems, or structures, let alone engaging with the culture of almost what you might call eroticized expressive individualism in the world. Unsurprisingly, the inverse was also true, in that a lot of position papers simply asserted a position without actually substantiating it with careful theological reflection. Many papers simply were just a list of cans and can'ts without really nuanced whys. And finally, and most importantly, most of the resources I read focused either on theological convictions, what we believe, or ministry constructs, what we do, but very few resources focused on culture, that is, what we value. Beyond the structures and systems of church, what sort of holistic life together are we trying to foster in our churches? What sort of relations at an organic level are we hoping to promote? Is there a more comprehensive vision for men and women in the church? Hence the need, as we're thinking about it, not just for a position paper or a statement of belief, but step two, thinking about a theological vision. This is how Tim Keller defines a theological vision. It's a vision for what you're going to do with your doctrine in a particular time and place. It is a faithful restatement of the gospel with rich implications for life, ministry, and mission in a type of culture at a moment in history. So a theological vision will be both comprehensive and contextual, which means that how complementarity is expressed in my church at Cross and Crown will necessarily look different to how it's expressed in yours, and that's appropriate. Along the way, one thing I noticed to do with theological vision is this is where a culture that may veer towards a form of fundamentalism can be actually quite unhealthy. So if we have a posture that defaults to Christ against culture, it'll tend to reject the relevance of culture or the importance of context and incline towards imposing almost a cookie-cutter complementarity in every context. I think a good theological vision will have a healthy posture towards culture that both seeks to synthesize and to transform as well. Which means that when it came to writing something, we didn't just want to focus on convictions and constructs, we wanted to focus on culture. Because we actually realized that that's actually where so many of our disagreements lay. Sure, there were disagreements about whether women or men or who could lead the service or preach at a weekend away, but we actually had far more debates over how men and women should relate to each other in the everyday life of church. More on that later. Step one, read everything. Step two, write something. Step three, we started consulting. This kind of correlates to step two in Cotter's 8-step change management model. It's the building a guiding coalition sort of thing. But it's actually much more about just than change management. This is actually a really complex and sensitive issue. And though you might hope that the senior pastor is probably the most theologically attuned or mature or educated in the church, it doesn't often mean that he's necessarily very relationally sensitive. Sometimes the senior pastor may be the more relationally tone-deaf. I needed a whole team of men and women around me to help write this together. And naturally, they were going to be working from the centre out, my church council and my staff team. We also did want to bring in external theological input. The idea that we could be wrong is a very strong motivator. So we spoke to 5 men and 5 women who would read and provide feedback on our theological vision. That was, on a personal level, the most terrifying thing I have ever done. It was like submitting your 4th-year project to 10 examiners, and they all came back saying something totally different. So that was very helpful. But that was actually really helpful on one level because they wouldn't all agree with each other. And it forced us to actually be clear about our convictions and the things that we cared about. But they also highlighted weaknesses not only in substance, but also in form. They helped us understand not just what we're saying, but how things are read and how things are understood and the impact of our words on a church culture. So, how did we consult? As I said, we started by focusing on the centre, building that guiding coalition. It all started with 2 full days of our staff team and our church council coming together to thrash it out. Everyone had to read Kevin DeYoung's book, Men and Women in the Church, before coming. And we had Joe Gibbs from Reach Australia join us for those 2 days. I think those 2 days were the most important 2 days that we had. And having Joe Gibbs there was really, really helpful. It didn't just help us identify our blind spots. It also, if I can share quite honestly, it also helped me because it helped show our counsellor and staff team that it's not just that Adam's crazy and he's doing his thing, right? Like, very few people actually know what pastors do from Monday to Saturday. And so to actually involve other people in the process, that, he's not just kind of on one of his hobby horses. There are actually really theologically thoughtful gospel workers who think that this issue is worth reflecting on together. Every pastor has to deal with the personal thought that hopefully I'm not crazy, and bringing friends in from the outside can be a healthy circuit breaker and reality check both for ourselves and our team. You'll also see that in the end, we end up going through about 10 versions of our theological vision, and I also had to write 3 supplementary papers, which we'll talk about in a moment. Step 1, read everything. Step 2, write something. Step 3, start consulting. And step 4, where I want to probably spend the most amount of time, reflect deeply, because this is actually where everything ground to a halt. Once you write the first thing, that's easy. What comes after the first thing is really hard. I think the gap between version 1 and version 2 was about 6 months and about 6 meetings as well. It would have been easy for us to just write something, integrate feedback and send it out, but this is a nuanced issue that demands deep reflection. And as we reflected together on the roles and relationships of men and women, we noticed that 2 other theological issues emerged very quickly. Here's the first one. What is the nature of authority in the church? What is the nature of authority in the church? So I wrote a supplementary paper on that, the nature of authority in the church, and I tried to engage some of these questions. Is all authority in the church necessarily the authority we find in 1 Timothy 2? What exactly is this sort of authority that we find in 1 Timothy 2? What does that involve? What are its extents and limits? And are there any other forms of authority in the church that women or non-ordained men can exercise? And that's quite important. It's not just about men and women. If we're talking about authority, you're actually talking about pastors and elders and then everyone else. They're the 3 questions that I tried to engage. As we reflected on these issues, I realised that many of us talk about 1 Timothy 2 as if it's the only form of authority in the church. But when you think about it, actually, at any one time, a whole range of different authorities are always being exercised and exchanged in any number of directions within the church. So, a pastor may exercise what we'll call ecclesial authority when he preaches a Sunday sermon. I think that one's clear-ish. But in another way, he submits to the domestic authority of the elderly lady in whose home they meet for their midweek small group. There is another sort of authority that's going on there as well. Or, if you have a godly qualified woman directing the ministry in your church, is she exercising authority? I think so. I assume so. But is she exercising the kind of authority that we find in 1 Timothy 2? Maybe. Maybe not. But we need to think about these things and talk about these things. Hence our conclusion that the great risk is to totalize the ecclesial authority of 1 Timothy 2 as somehow the only authority that you find in a church community. And if you do that, if all authority is categorized as 1 Timothy 2 authority, then the exercise of any form of leadership or any level of leadership will necessarily be restricted to the pastors and elders. And it wouldn't just exclude women, it would also exclude unordained men as well. So even if the authority of 1 Timothy 2 is the one ring to rule them all, does it mean that there are no other subordinate rings of authority in the church? I'm not going to give an answer to that, but they're the things that we had to think about. Secondly, we need to think about where do we primarily locate complementarity. This was probably the most complex one to write because it's very intangible. But let me try and do my best to explain. Classically, most of us locate authority either in the office of elder or the function of teaching. And when you read 1 Timothy 2 and 3, there's something entirely right about that. There is an authority vested in the office of elder, and that elder or pastor is responsible for teaching the word. But here's the risk. If we locate complementarity purely, primarily, or entirely in our roles, that is, in what we do, the risk is we actually might end up driving men and women apart rather than bringing them together. So if we try and create structures and systems and spaces for men to do men things over here and women to do women things over there, you end up having a distinction of role, but actually eliminating the relationship between them. Let me illustrate. We might begin with the theological conviction that the office of elder should be held only by qualified men. That's our theological conviction. Most or many churches then will take the next step further in our ministry practice and say, therefore, only men should be in the room when making a decision on our governing body. Or, only men should have a vote on the church council. Now, I want to offer that may be one or two potentially valid expressions of that underlying conviction, but it also risks a distortion. Because if you end up making that move, you actually, by removing women from the room, you actually end up separating men and women from each other. And then the irony is you remove the possibility of real complementarity altogether because there's no relationship between the men and women at all. In fact, I suspect that if we locate complementarity primarily in roles and responsibilities, we end up in this funny place where things about headship and submission, even in marriage, become all about who has the casting vote. And we end up in these convoluted decision-making trees just so that we don't encroach on each other's space. Now, I'm not saying roles and responsibilities aren't relevant, but I think that they flow out of our relations with one another. I've been thinking about the idea about persons in relation. That is, our roles matter, but as I said, they derive from our relations with one another as men and women or as people. So it's interesting that in marriage and the church, the language of head and helper, they're not functional titles, but they're organic and relational titles. So complementarity in marriage isn't really just about a wife advising and a husband deciding, but a husband and a wife loving and helping each other to make decisions together. And I worry that if we primarily locate complementarity in what we do, we may just end up with very strange mechanical processes between men and women rather than a set of orderly, dynamic relations with one another that reflect the beauty of the gospel. So we wrote in our second supplementary paper, the challenge with expressing complementarity in the constructs of a church is that we are seeking to give organizational expression to what is actually fundamentally an organic relation. And it is possible to so overstructure our church that we end up separating men and women according to their so-called roles and ironing out the relations between them. I find the household metaphor really helpful because it brings together the organic and the organizational. It gives you, everyone's got their place in the body, but we're still together in the same household. So those are two theological issues that emerged and that we needed to somehow engage with inadequately. We also discovered that two cultural attitudes also surfaced. Let me try to depict this with a diagram and it may make sense. We'll find out. We began to realize that whether a church is complementarian or egalitarian in its theological convictions is only one part of the equation. There is another axis, and actually this is the axis that most people tend to feel. It's whether a church prioritizes the integration of men and women or the segregation, separation, or apartness of them. Now, of course, it's a spectrum. It's not a binary category, as it were. And it's interesting that classically we might define complementarity as equal in value but distinct in roles, but we don't really necessarily emphasize togetherness or apartness from one another. I had a lot of young guys at church ask me, Adam, why is it, and I don't know if this is true in Sydney, but they said, why is it that in Melbourne when we look at other complementarian churches, men and women don't talk to each other? Why are there women's ministries over here and men's ministries over there, and the men's ministries are all about courage over a Saturday morning barbecue. That's far too early. And then the women's ministries are about gentleness with lots of flowers. And I'm not sure. Why do we prioritize Titus 2 as we are appropriately at this conference, and rightly so, with men discipling men and women discipling women? But what do we think about 1 Corinthians 11, where women, if I could venture to say it, disciple men by publicly prophesying in a mixed gathering? Or 1 Timothy 5, where women are mothers and sisters to Timothy? Or Colossians 3, where brothers and sisters teach and admonish one another? Or 1 Samuel 25, where King David is said to obey Abigail's voice? So it turns out that you can actually have complementarian convictions, but the manner in which it's expressed can be through a culture that either brings men and women together or puts them apart. Now, I'm sure there's a range of historical and cultural factors that incline churches and Christians in one direction or another. So you might think of the Billy Graham rule. It's a classic example of one where men and women might be more apart, but I suspect that there may have been good reasons for that at that time. Now, beneath those two cultural, or that cultural dynamic, sits another cultural dynamic. We realize, and this is a generalization, but generally speaking, we observe that churches tend to incline towards segregation or integration, apartness or togetherness, based on how socially conservative they are. I don't know if that's true or not, but this is my guess, so don't hold me to it. I couldn't think of another word to describe the opposite of conservative. I tried liberal or progressive, but I thought that wouldn't go down very well. So I just went with chill or relaxed. Our observation was that if a church is theologically complementarian and more socially conservative, or maybe you might consider risk-averse, it will tend towards separating men and women to separate spaces. And the predominant line is it's out of fear that something might go wrong, that the relationship between men and women might appear or actually be inappropriate in some way. Now, maybe those fears are well-founded, maybe they're not, but they're there. So, versus a church like Cross and Crown. So this is really interesting because I didn't get to choose my members, they just kind of turned up. And so it turns out that our church is, though theologically conservative, socially on the more relaxed end of the spectrum. I hope not cavalier or irresponsible, but less risk-averse, I think. So let me venture a guess as to why. It may be a result of our age, our background, our profession, but most of the men and women in our church will look at complementarian churches where there's a greater separation between men and women, and they'll say to me, it's weird. And I think our work context plays into it. Because people who are in workplaces with a high degree of interaction between men and women will then come to church and find it particularly jarring. One of our male leaders said to me, I'm closer to women at work than I am to women at church, and apparently I'm their brother in Christ, so I'm not quite sure how that works. And then he said to me, and this is just our church, so I'm not saying it's anywhere else, he goes, I feel like if I talk to a woman at our church in public, I'm considered a threat. So I'm not quite sure where that sits, whether that's true elsewhere, but I just highlight that to say the culture of integration or segregation or separation, togetherness or apartness, I suspect is partly informed by our social context. They're the two cultural attitudes that surfaced. Two relational questions that were asked. What do complementarity, manhood and womanhood, look like outside marriage and the church? Because both are ordered relations of headship and submission, what does complementarity look like for a single unordained man relating to a married woman at church? It's a good question. And in an integrated vision of church life, the age-old question, can men and women really be friends? Maybe this is a uni student question, but I think it's always there. So, and interestingly, that question ended up being probably the biggest subsidiary question of the entire year. Because it actually hit how we think about marriage and singleness. It addressed trust and insecurity within marriage. It bled through into our pre-marriage counselling as well. It hit a lot of issues. And I think that's an important question to answer, because at a cultural level, it gives integrity to our constructs. So there's no point of us, our church, trying to employ women on staff if men and women don't even talk to each other. I think we need to think about that. So we actually ran a pastoral seminar on that exact question, and I was really shocked by how many people turned up and were interested in it. We ended up basing our culture on 1 Timothy 5, the household of God motif, and this is what we said. The deepest intimacy that all of us can enjoy is our spiritual fathers, spiritual mothers, spiritual brothers, and spiritual sisters. A healthy church will not separate men and women any more than a healthy family would separate brothers and sisters. Though, while our friendship with men and women is equal in quality, it ought to be different in expression. Equally intimate but differently expressed. And Paul suggests the intimate friendship between men and women in the church should be marked by purity. We can hold those things together. So, spend a fair bit of time on point 4, why. Here's a key takeaway, which I think was the most important step of all. Almost every point of contention was a product of our pre-existing culture, assumptions, and values. Our age and generation, our family upbringing, our church, our denomination, our college, our education, profession. Interestingly, good and bad experiences were massively significant in where people landed on that last question over friendship between men and women, and our ethnic and cultural background as well. I don't want to mislead you and suggest that the key texts are somehow easy to understand, but it is to say that how we read our Bible and do our theology are shaped by those other deeper assumptions and our bigger worldviews that we're not even quite aware of. All right, let me power through the final steps and then show you the theological vision. Number 5, go public. This is what we did. So here's a shopping list. Every year, our church, we set a mission goal and a theological goal. So something that we want to do for our life and ministry together in terms of fulfilling our mission in the city of Melbourne, and also something that we want to think about together. So every year, we hold an annual conference, and last year, we had Rob and Claire Smith and Susan Ahn to come and teach us on God's good design. I didn't think it was fair for me to just handball it to externals. So then I had to come in and own it myself with a 5-week doctrine series on men and women to try and enculturate it in our church life with a corresponding Bible study focused on application. We held pastoral seminars on healthier marriages and healthier friendships. We more explicitly integrated biblical complementarity into our pre-marriage counselling. And importantly, we published a family violence policy, which is remarkably important when teaching on this issue. That's what we did. I don't know whether we did a good job of it or not, but I'll tell you one story. We have a number of uni groups. People think our church is a uni group. But we had one of our small groups there, and this young guy said, "Oh, look, I just don't know that I'm on board with the idea of submission. It just sounds really awful." And then everyone in his small group said, "Have you been listening to anything we've been talking about at church over the last 6 months?" And they could explain to him what actually was a healthy view of submission. So I'll take that as a win. Here's some low-hanging fruit with the changes that we tried to make at step 6. We ensured that at every meeting of our church council, deaconesses were present, not just at occasional meetings where the agenda item listed was a women's issue, which I think is weird because when you think about it, everything is a women's issue because every issue affects both men and women. So I'm not quite sure how you decide which is or isn't, but that's there. We set gender, age, and ethnicity targets for our ministries. I'm not a fan of quotas, but I think targets can be helpful just to be conscious of things, that's all. We also introduced one another services where we platform lay men and women in our church who have opportunities to teach and admonish one another on Sundays, as it were, through interviews or even monologues. And we explicitly promoted ministry internships and traineeships, not only for men, but also for women. And I'm so glad that this year we have 1 man and 1 woman as our interns this year. Hi, David, Nancy, and everyone watching at home. Some major changes. Firstly, will we set up a formal women's ministry or employ someone as a women's worker to care for women in terms of pastoral care? Question number 2. Will we open up the role of service leader to qualified men and women, or everyday men and women? Thirdly, how comfortable are we with a woman teaching the Bible in what we would consider a secondary teaching and fellowship context? So if you've got a weekend away, a workshop, prayer meeting, how do you think about those things? Fourthly, should the church council as our governing body be comprised of pastors and elders only, or also qualified women? If it includes qualified women, in what way? For example, a voice but no vote, or a voice and a vote. And for that, I wrote another supplementary paper. If you want to know my answer to those 4 questions, you can ask me in Q&A. So here's our 3-year change management process. We tried to articulate it last year. We're going to try and enculturate it this year and implement it next year. The biggest takeaway from this slide is it takes a lot of time, particularly with the big ticket items. So if we're going to change our constitution or expand or limit the ways in which men and women can teach in church, we can't just rip a Band-Aid off and do it. You need a conversation with your church as well. We need to actually have a proper conversation with them. Final step, keep discipling. How do we keep the heat up, but also not too high, because there are other things we're trying to do in church life as well? We need to make sure that our theological vision doesn't just collect dust on a bottom shelf, but we actually use it in pre-marriage counselling, in our membership course, and in onboarding new leaders. I want to focus on point 5, interestingly. I've been thinking about this one, so if you've got violent objections, you can take them out on me later in Q&A. I think it starts with the senior pastor, actually. So here's an interesting question. How does the senior pastor of a church receive the input of godly women? So if our church is promoting an integrated complementarity, should I as a senior pastor be proactive in being coached, mentored, or supervised by not just godly men, but also godly women? Am I missing something vital from my own maturity and ministry if I'm only surrounded by men? Is that a diminished complementarity in some form? Now, I think that how you answer that partly turns on whether you see coaching, mentoring, pastoral supervision, all those things as vertical authoritative relationships. I'm not quite sure. That's the big question in my head right now. But I suspect that senior pastors need not just spiritual fathers, but also spiritual mothers and sisters in the faith. How we exactly do that, I'm not sure. All right, the moment you've been waiting for, the theological vision and then questions. I'm not going to read through the whole thing. Number 1, we begin with a preamble that seeks to frame the issue of men and women. Importantly, we want to position biblical complementarity as the perfectly balanced middle. But importantly, to not have people conflate it with what you might consider conservative patriarchalism. I don't like the language of patriarchalism. I think it imports a whole range of things that come with it. But if I can be honest, I do look at some complementarian churches and think to myself, it does kind of feel like it. So I just want to say we're not that. And I think that's important to distinguish. We then move on to the first section on theological convictions. And we posit that God created and redeemed men and women to be, firstly, equal in dignity. You'll see that in this section, it's really important for us to highlight the value of singleness because complementarity so easily just collapses into the marriage relationship. We want to show that the equality of the sexes isn't purely expressed in marriage, but actually begins in our very createdness. Now, notwithstanding everything I said before about not liking the language of roles or responsibilities primarily, you'll forgive me, we said distinct in roles. I think it's hard really to find adequate language to capture everything we want to say with its nuances, but we do come to complementarian relations later. You'll see that we start with creation, because we don't want complementarity to be an arbitrarily asserted order in marriage and the church without some sort of coherent basis in creation. But an important guardrail, in grounding it in creation, we want to be very careful to not give into cultural stereotypes. So hence we say the particular manner in which biblical manhood and womanhood are expressed is mediated through personality, shaped by culture, and is therefore a matter of godly wisdom. Maybe that's a cheat. It could be. I think the Danvers statement has a cheat where they say it finds an echo in every human heart. I agree with that. I'm not quite sure what that means. But I think it's an open question for us to keep exploring what that means to be men and women in creation. But I think you can't get there by starting with marriage and the church and then extrapolating out of an ordered authoritative relationship as to what men and women are ontologically. Distinct in roles, it was important for us to highlight all the ways in which women exercise a broad range of ministries in the Bible, including leading and teaching. We want to remember that not all authority in the church is the authority of 1 Timothy 2. So we say Christian women are encouraged to lead the church and teach the word in a manner that honours our God-ordained design. We were careful not to drill down too concretely into things because I think there needs to be a flexibility of application from time to time. The third part we really care about, that God created and redeemed us to be together in loving and fruitful fellowship. We really wanted to highlight that the distinctions between men and women in the church are to be expressed together and not apart. And you'll see there all the examples of married couples, single men, female deacons, household leaders, and male and female co-workers in the New Testament. This may be my favourite paragraph in the theological vision, so I'm going to read it to you as lovely bedtime reading. Complementarity also requires the partnership of everyday Christian men and women to whom the language of Adelphoi refers not just as brothers, but as brothers and sisters. So, Christian men and women, both married and single, ought to exercise a full breadth of one another ministry. We ought to love one another, serve one another, and submit to one another. We are even called to teach and admonish one another, albeit not with the authority of a pastor or overseer, but with the love of a brother or sister. Just as King David was corrected by Abigail and obeyed her voice, Christian men should humbly receive the loving correction of their spiritual sisters. The absence of this one another ministry between brothers and sisters weakens the body and deprives us of each other's wisdom, care, and love. So there's our convictions and how we seek to articulate biblical complementarity. Then we really wanted to focus on the culture that we want to foster in our church. 5 points. We want to value who we are over what we do. So much of this discussion comes back to finding our worth in what we're able to do or not to do. Secondly, we're explicit in prioritizing the deep things we share in Christ. That yes, there are real differences between men and women, but we don't want to overemphasize those differences that we miss our shared humanity. Thirdly, we do want to embrace our God-ordained differences. We do want to think about what it looks like to be gentle as a man and gentle as a woman. What does rebuking as men look like versus rebuking as women? Maybe there's a difference, maybe there isn't. But if you think about 1 Timothy 5, where Paul writes to Timothy, don't rebuke an older man, but exhort him as a father, older women as mothers, younger men as brothers, younger women as sisters with all purity, I wonder if that means that the manner of exhortation may look different based on who you are and who they are. We want to explicitly pursue integration over segregation. We want to bring people together, and we want to promote partnership at every level. Importantly, I'm going to read to you a section of that right now because I think this was quite important when it came to the issue of complementarity in relations. We write, and it's not on the screen, I'm sorry, it says, just as in marriage, the roles of men and women in the church should not be reduced to a vote, a casting decision, or a seat at a table. Instead, our complementarity is beautifully expressed in our relations, postures, and attitudes that reflect God's good design. I think we want to keep the heat up on actually it's how we relate to one another that frames our roles and responsibilities. All right, finally, here's the 6 areas of church life where we've sought to articulate the manner in which biblical complementarity are expressed. And after this, you may ask any question that you want, and I will try to answer them. We tried to think about it in terms of church leadership, so that's our church council and our staff team. How do we express partnership at every level, whilst also embracing our God-ordained differences in our staff team and our governing body? How do we seek to express partnership in our gathered worship? What are we trying to do with our small group network? That's Bible and life together. How do we do that when it comes to serving? What does it look like when it comes to children and youth? And importantly, what does that look like when it comes to secondary teaching and fellowship contexts? In terms of change management, I just want to offer finally before questions that we found actually the easiest people to engage with were biblically thoughtful millennials who haven't been part of a culture war before. They didn't really have a stake in the fight one way or the other. The people that we've found hardest to convince, this is ironic, are complementarians. That's been really hard because I think this is seen as a shibboleth issue. And so if you are seen to tweak one thing in one direction or another, it's quite hard. If people have come with us for the journey, it's been great. We have had some people who've been absent from church for a while and they land back in November and they're like, what's going on? And I'm like, well, you know, if you're here since last November, we've been having a conversation about these things. So that's been interesting. I'll stop there. I think we've got more than enough time for lots of questions. So thank you.